I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Welcome everybody back to another edition of I Mix What I Like, imixwhatilike.org. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. And joining us now for this discussion is Dr. Monique Bedasse, who is an assistant professor of history and African American studies at Washington University in St. Louis, where she teaches courses in African history, Caribbean history, and Africana studies. She is also a fellow graduate of the legendary Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University, but joins us now specifically to talk with us about her latest book, Jah Kingdom, Rastafarians, Tanzania, and Pan-Africanism in the Age of Decolonization, a new book freshly out on the University of North Carolina Press. Dr. Bedasse, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start with, I told you before we were going to get started that I wanted to start with something admittedly kind of trifling in a pop cultural sense. You know, both of us we teach, we're on campuses a lot, and invariably it seems that without end, generation after generation, every semester we get the kind of a reoccurrence of the dorm room poster selection variation or t-shirt selection, or we get students coming on campus, and a lot of them to this day like to wear or make reference in some form or fashion to Bob Marley, often in, almost exclusively, unfortunately, in the context of just smoking weed. Or at least just basically, with his more popular forms of music. But so I wanted to start with that and have you maybe talk a little bit about Bob Marley and how he figures into your book and into your story, and where you're trying to take us with this discussion of Rastafarianism. Because you actually write at one point, you talk about, in fact, you say here, the highly recognizable Rasta iconography has long been associated with the process by which the once marginal movement transitioned into the mainstream, as well as the ways in which the international consumers of such iconography have adapted Rastafari to different local circumstances. Jah Kingdom instead emphasizes an interior history of Rastafari that sees its evolution from within and not from the perspectives of those who have adapted the movement's cultural symbols to different local circumstances. So when I read that, I thought immediately of just this college experience and students and this cultural adaptation or appropriation of Bob Marley and these symbols without the kind of depth that you bring to it in this book. So with that long sort of, again, trifling beginning, could you use that to bring us into the depth and substance that is in your book?
Okay, so it's not trifling. I think most people will enter Rastafari through such a reference, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important part of the history, how Rastafari, its international growth through the prism of culture. And Bob Marley appears in the book in chapter 3 briefly in terms of his relationship with former Prime Minister of Jamaica, Michael Manley. Mm-hmm. But, my book is actually trying to take readers away from that interpretation of Rastafari's international growth, right? So I think I would say the most fundamental conceptual leap I'm asking readers to make is to think of Rastafari's international growth less in terms of its transmission through culture, so reggae music, art, etc., and more in terms of the movement of Rasta people, and specifically repatriation, and for my book, repatriation to Tanzania in the post-independence period. And when we make that shift, then it opens us up to not only the history of how Rastafarians translated their dream of repatriation into a lived reality, but also their continued, ever evolving, but continued connection to Pan-African politics and practice, right? Ideas and practice of Pan-Africanism.
So, sort of continuing with that segue of sorts, you write also that the movement that is the Rastafari movement has fallen prey to reductionist and sanitized narratives that strip oppositional movements of their radicalism. Rastafari's dynamic and ever poignant critiques of racism and capitalism throughout the 1970s and beyond have been concealed by the focus on Rastafari's popular culture. The movement has been subjected to the same hegemonic structures that have frozen Martin Luther King Jr. in his I Have a Dream speech, extracted only one love from Bob Marley, and converted Nelson Mandela, the freedom fighter, into Mandela, the lovable voice of reconciliation. So if we could just maybe start from there, and or continue on from there rather, and talk a little bit about some of the things I wanted to specifically ask you about. That is, how does, for instance, Rastafari define Pan-Africanism in the the context of variations of Pan-African definitions?
Right.
And then specifically, as you talk about where does Tanzania and its particular relationship to Pan-African historical struggle and beyond fit into this discussion?
Okay, how did I know that you would pick that passage out? I knew it. Okay, so yeah, I think so as a historian of Africa and the Caribbean, right? I'm always struck by, and of Pan-Africanism, I'm always struck by how we remember certain figures, right? So when we think of Mandela, and I think of Mandela being basically a terrorist in the 60s, how we would define a terrorist now, right? And now all of a sudden he was, I've heard a colleague say a sort of Santa Clausification of Mandela, right?
And
And
in fact, he was on the terrorist watch list up until shortly before his death, if I'm not mistaken, like even well into his post-apartheid career.
The juxtaposition, right, of, what he represented to the Western world, in the 60s compared to what he became in the 90s and beyond, right? It's just like a fascinating thing to observe. So I think about Rasta in reference to all of those college posters and everything else that you see, right? Is, I think when we focus on culture as the only, I'm not saying culture can't do political work at all, but I think it's a very, very different history if we look, for example, through the prism of Pan-Africanism, right? And we think about Rasta in terms of repatriation. Not only do we get a story of this relationship between Africa and its diaspora, right? But we do not lose sight of the fact that in the post-independence period, right, there's a shift across Africa and the Caribbean, in that there's a shift from colonial rule to independent states. And what we have are independent states led by Black people, right? And that is a very generative and hopeful, heady moment for Black people, right? Because on one hand, it allows for greater Pan-African mobilization. And this is where states like Ghana, under Nkrumah, and Tanzania under Nyerere step in, right? And become this impetus for diasporic mobilization, right? And so through this repatriation, we are able to really focus on not just the fact that Rastafarians put the case to Nyerere, saying, okay, you are a Pan-Africanist, Africa is home. We think of ourselves, our primary identity is African and not Jamaican. Our identity never come in a diasporic, or freedom can never come in a diasporic space, right? And so we focus on what does it mean that Rastas have always thought about, theorized about African liberation. When they're in Africa, close to the action, Tanzania becomes this mecca of Pan-African activity, right? And members of all of the liberation movements of Southern Africa are stationed there. So they're able to act on these ideas that they'd had for decades, right? What does it mean that they've always had a critique of capitalism? And how does that translate into this period when we have Black governments that begin to suppress radical Black activists within their borders, right? How do those ideas about race, which of course we know that nationalism does not in any way solve the problems of Black people globally, right? So while it opens up these new opportunities, it also points out the divisions, right, even more. Class or the fact that these politicians become these elites, right? So what does that mean in terms of the evolution of Pan-Africanism? And I'm arguing that through the repatriation, right, we're able to take Rastafari's politics very seriously. What does it mean that they've always tried to champion a life of communalism, that socialism, even communism, has been associated with Rasta for a very long time? What does it mean that they Nyerere's policy of Ujamaa, African socialism, was able to resonate with Rastafarians in a profound way. So Pan-Africanism for Rastafarians in a very basic way, meant that they were of African descent, all African people were connected, right? And that in terms of repatriation, they were committed to a global struggle for liberation of all African people, right? And so repatriation was not just about this dream to escape Babylon, so to speak, right? But it was about their participation also in this wider Pan-African struggle for liberation. And as a result of that, the repatriation also yields this history of how Rasta is connected, has been connected, and was certainly connected in this period to a wide Pan-African network of scholars, politicians, lay people, activists, and others.
In as you were responding there, I was thinking about, because you also talk a little bit about both through the sort of personalized example of Michael Manley as the head of Jamaica, but more broadly speaking, the state itself and its relationship to Rastafarianism. In that, yes, for much of us outside of Jamaica, Rastafarianism and Bob Marley and reggae are the popular cultural export. But that doesn't mean that the state itself was always welcoming of that movement. And as you were just describing, Rastas represented a number of potentially threatening ideological and cultural positions vis-a-vis the state. So that was one of the, anyway, I actually, maybe this is a good point to ask you to say another word or two about that, the relationship of these states, particularly Jamaica and then Tanzania, to Rastafarian movements. And I guess let me just say very quickly, because my one trip to Tanzania in the 90s, I ended up staying briefly with a brother who was a Rastafarian. And I admitted at that time I was confused by that, because I was like, I thought you were all primarily just in Jamaica. And he was like, he introduced me to a whole community of Rastas over there. And then he went further to say not only were Rastas not just indigenous or specific to Jamaica, but that he himself, having been born in Olduvai Gorge, where humanity is said to have begun, he was saying we are the first people, literally, like the Rastas and African connection is innate from the beginning of humanity, which I at the time thought was wild and very different. But your book adds a lot of depth and validation to that claim that he was making to me a long time ago. But anyway, if you would just say a quick word or two about the relationship and anything else you wanted to add about what you said about Michael Manley in your book between the state and Rastafarianism as movements and spiritual practices.
Okay, so Rasta has, I should say, Jamaica has this long history, right, of this sort of contradictory history. That on one hand, we're known for, the radicalism of Marcus Garvey and Rasta, and on the other, this very colonial-minded population, right, with all the crises that come with mental enslavement, right? And so a part of the sanitation of the way in which Rasta has been sanitized, I should say, or the history of it, is that because Rasta now is associated with the nation in terms of how we market, tourism, for example, right? That people sometimes miss that Rastas were ostracized in Jamaica for such a long time, and in some ways still today, right? So that Rasta, in terms of trying to repatriate to Africa, of course, that is symbolic in terms of the way that threatened Jamaica as a nation state, right? So I talk about that in the book. But what's really interesting about that is, in my period, I'm talking about Rastafari's desire to repatriate as something that contradicts the rise of the nation state, right? So Pan-Africanism is alive and well, was a part of the experiences of Black folk before colonialism ended, and continued to be a real part of, of the Black radical tradition after the nation state became the symbol of freedom, so to speak, right? And so, but at the same time, these leaders, right, are also engaging Pan-African politics in our period, right? So Michael Manley is this, what we call in Jamaican context, brown, um, meaning not phenotypically black or dark skinned, right? But I don't think he gets, back to the contradictions, I don't think Michael Manley has gotten the credit he deserves for his Pan-African politics, right? And I argue in the book that he's heavily influenced by Rastafari, right? And also, benefits from his wife's position as a Pan-Africanist in her own right, and the fact that she's phenotypically black and dark-skinned, right? So it's very, very complicated. And so he is actually, and did forge all of these really important connections with African freedom fighters, did, offer to send Jamaican troops to help, the liberation movements in Southern Africa, and did suffer for it in a local Jamaican context, right? At the same time, because he wasn't working class and knew that the people would not have necessarily seen him as black, he struggled with that contradiction, right? Struggled with, I suppose, whether or not he fit in. And so you have the juxtaposition of this leader who was actually very, very, or represented a significant shift for the People's National Party, the party that he led. The party his father led was certainly not involved in the type of Pan-African politics that Michael was, right? But the other side of that story is that Michael Manley's own politics was heavily influenced by the politics of Julius Nyerere. And so this is where, the Rastafarian repatriation actually coincides with the Third World as a project, right? And the way in which Pan-Africanism becomes coterminous with this Third World project. So on one hand, it is the impact of these African leaders, right? Who are presenting different versions of African socialism to the world, but are also championing Pan-Africanism and trying to figure out a way to deal with establishing sovereignty in their newly independent states while also representing Pan-Africanism. It is a very strange and contradictory world in this period, whereby there are these accomplishments, right? And we have these nation states, but at the same time, colonial rule has not ended or had not ended in, the former Portuguese colonies like Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, South Africa, Namibia, right? And so the struggle continued, right? And so they're trying to balance, a sort of anti-colonial war in a so-called post-colonial period, right? And the repatriation happens within this context, right? So we also get to, it also allows us a window into, okay, so how does race play out in this period as well? And race becomes, even though both Nyerere and Rastafarians recognize race as socially constructed and recognize that we have to think in large measure beyond race, that race remains crucially important, right? Because white supremacy remains a reality in that period as well. So it's a very complex period.
As we move towards, I guess, a last segment here, admittedly, I've done what I'm a major critic of. That is, I started with what I'm considering the pop cultural and trifling and the male, whereas in your book, you start with the grassroots and the female. So I wanted you to talk with us about, if I make sure I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Kisembo Karudi, and how her story, which is central to your book, is central to the story you're trying to tell, or to the history you're trying to expose us to regarding Rastafarianism, Tanzania, Jamaica, and Pan-African history and struggle.
Right. So I opened the book with Kisembo Karudi purposely, right? Because I want people to, at the very beginning, imagine Rastafarians as not just men, right, but also women, families, right? And so she becomes a very important part of the story because, even though we have this, long history of scholars grappling with, the extent to which Rastafari is male-centered, how much of it is about scholars not looking for women as opposed to Rasta men themselves, marginalizing women. We have all these debates within the movement, right? And so in a movement that's so diverse, I would say there's obvious male dominance, right? Which has changed over time, obviously. It's not what it was in 1930, no. But at the same time, the group that the specific Rastas, and I at great length explain in the book who I'm talking about, right? Which specific group, how we identify them within this or amid this plurality that is the movement, right? And the historical documents, the primary documents about the Rastafari, about the repatriation, are written by men. And they did not talk about the women or the families more broadly at all, right?
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I did think it was interesting to note that you said both the oral and written traditions were dominated by men, which I as just even in different media, the patriarchy is prevalent.
Right,
I thought that
right,
was important to note. Sorry, go ahead, please.
And in the case of, and I mean, the men that I spoke to, right, were not all patriarchal, or one in particular, Kisembo's husband, Ras Bupe Karudi. He talked about his struggles and didn't talk about her at all. And when he mentioned his family, it was within the context of the sacrifices he made as, in his words, suffering servant of Jah, right? That, the political work of the repatriation was a male undertaking, right? And that is not unique to Rastafari, of course, right? That many Pan-Africanists men have presented the struggle in very, very male and masculine terms. And so another issue I had is that the other women refused to speak. And I talk about this in the introduction, right? So I do not represent or present Kisembo's story as a story that represents all Rastafarian women, or even all Rasta women who went to Tanzania. But I do talk a lot about the fact that her story disrupts the narrative of her husband's account, right? And forces us to think about not only the contributions of Rastafari women to repatriation, but to the political commitments of Rasta more broadly. And also the role of families, that intersection between this political work and the very, very personal histories of love and relationships and family. In large measure, she, not only supported, the family financially, right? But had to deal with, her husband's neglect in some areas, right? And she also cautions against, thinking about that as a Rasta thing. Explaining that for her, she thought her husband became extreme, right? So in that way, she offers a very different prism through which to we can analyze Rastafari and repatriation. And I'm arguing also that repatriation allows us to think about the gender trouble within Rasta in different ways. How does that change because of the repatriation, right? What types of pressures do moving to a new environment and making decisions about where children go to school and confronting the realities of life in Africa, in continental Africa, in a way that might challenge romanticized notions of what happens on the continent, right? And so it is a history that, if we think about Rasta's international growth through repatriation, then we get to see gender, nation, socialism, all of those issues with which Rasta has been engaged, right? Are evolve. We can see how they evolve in a different milieu and within Africa in particular.
Well, I was trying to pull this up here because now with the digital world, the only way I can hold up a copy of the book is to do it this way with the Kindle. But I want to encourage people again, if they haven't already been by this very I think enlightening and inspiring conversation, to check out this new book, Jah Kingdom, Rastafarians, Tanzania, and Pan-Africanism in the Age of Decolonization by Dr. Monique Bedasse, who has been joining us here at I Mix What I Like. And I thank you very much for doing so. I really appreciated the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jared. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
And to the rest of you who are joining us, thank you for joining us as well. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say, to you we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody, and we'll catch you in the whirlwind. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.